The wind off Lake Superior does not just blow, it strips. It comes screaming down from the Canadian Shield, gathering momentum across 300 miles of open gray water, and by the time it hits the steel lattice of the Duluth Area Lift Bridge, it feels less like air and more like a physical assault. I was 135 feet above the water, kneeling on the grate of the North Tower machine room, elbow deep in the main sheave-bearing housing. It was a Tuesday. It was arguably the end of the world, though I did not know that yet. To me, it was just Grease Day, a quarterly ritual that involved 5-gallon buckets of heavy molybdenum disulfide lubricant, a pneumatic pump that always jammed, and the kind of cold that settles into your joints and stays there until May. My name is Elias Thorne. For the last 6 years, I've been the lead mechanical tech for the bridge. Most people see the bridge as a postcard icon, a massive steel arch that rises and falls to let the 1,000-foot ore boats pass into the harbor. I see it as a collection of failure points. I see the 900-ton counterweights hanging like guillotines inside the towers. I see the sheaves, 12 feet in diameter, singing under the tension of the cables. My job was simple. Keep the friction low, keep the rust at bay, and keep the traffic moving. I wiped a glob of black grease from the Zerk fitting with a shop rag, checking the expulsion. Good.
The old grease was purging, pushing out the contaminants. I adjusted the regulator on the air compressor, listening to the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the piston. The machine room, the house, as we called the operator's cabin spanning the width of the bridge, vibrated sympathetically. It was a box of corrugated steel and glass, uninsulated, smelling of ozone, stale coffee, and hydraulic fluid. Down below, the city of Duluth was waking up. Or at least, it should have been. Usually at 7 Peath, the Canal Park District is a mix of early delivery trucks and joggers punishing themselves on the lake walk. But when I stood up to stretch my back, wiping my hands on my coveralls, the view through the salt-crusted window was wrong. The traffic on the lift bridge approach was not moving. It was not just backed up. It was abandoned. A line of sedans and pickups sat motionless on the asphalt, doors hanging open like broken wings. I saw a Cisco delivery truck jackknifed sideways across the southbound lane, its trailer ripped open, cases of food scattered across the pavement like confetti. I did not panic. Panic is for people who do not understand mechanics. When a bearing screams, you do not scream back. You check the temperature, you check the load, you isolate the variable. I stepped out of the machine room onto the external catwalk, the wind instantly snatching the breath from my lungs.
The grating rattled under my boots, heavy red-wing loggers with composite toes. I walked to the edge, gripped the freezing handrail, and looked down. The sound hit me first. Usually the bridge is loud with the hum of tires on the steel decking and the groan of the wind. Today the dominant frequency was a chaotic, high-pitched wavering noise. Screaming. Distant, layered, continuous screaming. I pulled my binoculars from the case on my belt. There were Nikons, battered from years of inspecting cable splices. I brought them to my eyes and focused on the parking lot of the Maritime Museum below. It looked like a fluid dynamics simulation gone wrong. A crowd of people, maybe 200, was surging against the glass doors of the museum. But the movement was jagged, violent. I saw a man in a high-vis vest, probably a city worker, sprinting toward the canal wall. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He vaulted the railing and plunged into the freezing harbor water. A second later, 3 figures followed him over the rail. They did not vault. They just ran, straight off the edge, legs flailing, slamming into the dark water with zero self-preservation.
I lowered the binoculars. My radio, clipped to the chest pocket of my Carhartt vest, remained silent. The dispatcher in the ground-level control house, a guy named Miller who usually never shut up about his fantasy football league, had not said a word in an hour.
Miller, I keyed the mic. Status check. I'm seeing some activity on the north side. You got eyes on this? Static. Just the white noise of the open channel. I tried again. Control, this is Thorne. Do we have a maritime request? I'm seeing debris on the roadway. We need to clear it before the Paul R. Tregurtha makes the turn. Nothing. I looked back at the machine room. The bridge was currently in the fully raised position. We had lifted it at 0630 for a scheduled departure of a Salty, a Liberian-flagged vessel heading out to the Atlantic. The ship had passed, disappearing into the fog bank on the lake, but Miller had not given the all-clear to lower the span. The million-pound roadway was hovering 135 feet in the air, disconnected from the chaos below. Logic began to construct a flowchart in my head. Variable A. The city is in a state of civil collapse. Variable B. The ground level is dangerous. Variable C. I am currently isolated by altitude and steel. If I lowered the bridge, I restored the connection. I provided a path. But a path for what? I watched a cluster of figures near the souvenir shop drag a woman out of a Honda Civic. They did not rob her. They did not take the car. They swarmed her. The violence was primal, kinetic, like ants dismantling a beetle. I stepped back inside the machine room and locked the heavy steel door. The latch clicked, a solid, mechanical sound. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the transformer cabinet. My job description was to maintain the bridge, but inherent in maintenance is the preservation of the asset. And right now, the asset was this platform. And the operator. Me. I walked over to the main control panel. It was a wall of analog gauges, oversized buttons, and lever switches that dated back to the retrofit in the 80s. The lower button was green, the size of a hockey puck. It stared at me. If Miller was not answering, he was either gone or compromised. If I went down the tower elevator, I would exit directly onto the street level, right into the middle of that meat grinder. The elevator was a slow, rattling cage. A coffin. I grabbed my tool bag. It was a heavy canvas rigger's bag, stained with grease and oil. I needed to secure my position. The bridge span was not just a roadway, it was an island. But islands have shores, and my shores were the two towers. The span connects to the towers via massive guides. There are stairwells in each tower, and emergency ladders welded to the structure itself. The elevator was the easy way up, but the ladders were the hard way. And desperate people do hard things. I needed to sever the connection. I grabbed a 3/4-inch drive impact wrench and a socket set. I exited the machine room again, moving toward the South Tower access point. The span has a walkway that connects to the tower balcony when the bridge is raised. It's a metal gangway, hinged to accommodate the movement. The wind bit at my exposed face. I pulled my neck gaiter up over my nose. The gangway was a sturdy piece of galvanized steel, bolted to the deck structure. If I removed it, there would be a 6-foot gap between the tower and the span. A 6-foot jump over a 100-foot drop to the shipping canal. Doable for an athlete on a sunny day. Suicidal for a panicked mob in icy wind. I dropped to my knees on the grating. The bolts were rusted, covered in layers of marine paint. This was the reality of the Rust Belt. Nothing ever comes apart the way the manual says it should. I fit the socket over the first bolt head. It was a 24mm hex. I hammered the socket on with the palm of my hand to break the paint seal. I triggered the impact wrench. Whir, 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 tack, tack, tack.
The sound was deafening, a sharp staccato hammering that echoed off the steel girders. The bolt screamed as it turned, rust powder puffing out like smoke. I fought the torque, my wrist straining against the kickback. 1 bolt out, 3 to go on this side. I worked with a singular focus. The world below was dissolving into noise, sirens now, weaving together into a dissonant blanket of sound, but up here, it was just physics. Torque, tension, sheer strength. The second bolt snapped.
The head sheared off, leaving the rusted shank stuck in the flange. Damn it, I muttered into my scarf. I grabbed a pry bar from my bag. I did not need to be gentle. I was destroying the walkway, not servicing it. I moved to the other side. The 3rd and 4th bolts came out, hot to the touch from the friction. Now the gangway was loose, held only by gravity and the rust adhesion. I stood up, wedged the pry bar under the lip of the steel plate, and leaned my entire body weight into it. "Come on, you piece of junk," I grunted. The steel groaned. The rust seal cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The gangway shifted, sliding inches toward the abyss. I repositioned the bar, finding better leverage against a vertical stanchion. I heaved. The heavy plate tipped. It scraped against the concrete of the tower balcony, sparked once, and then fell. It did not make a sound when it hit the water. The wind swallowed the splash. I stared at the gap. 6 feet of open air. Below, the dark water of the ship canal churned, whitecaps forming in the chop. 1 access point down. 1 to go. I walked the length of the bridge to the north tower. The span is roughly 386 feet long. It felt like walking the deck of a ghost ship. The roadway stripes were faded yellow, covered in a thin dusting of granular snow that swirled in eddies around my boots. The north side was harder. This was the side closest to the chaos. As I knelt to work on the bolts of the north gangway, I could see the details of the panic below more clearly. I saw a police cruiser smash through a barricade and plow into a lamppost. The airbags did not deploy. The driver did not get out. I forced my eyes back to the bolts. Focus on the task. These bolts were newer, replaced during the inspection 2 years ago. They spun out easily. Too easily. I kicked the gangway free in under 5 minutes. It clattered down the side of the tower, bouncing off a structural cross brace with a massive clang that rang like a bell before vanishing into the canal. I stood up, breathing hard. The cold air burned my throat. I was isolated. The elevator doors on the span were locked from the inside, and even if someone called the car, they'd step out into empty air where the gangway used to be. I retreated back to the machine room, the house. I slammed the heavy door and threw the deadbolt. Then I engaged the secondary latch, a heavy iron bar that dropped into a U-bracket. The silence inside was heavy. The wind was muffled to a dull roar. The smell of grease was comforting, familiar. I checked my watch. 14. I had been up here for 7 hours. I had not eaten. I sat down in the operator's chair, a worn vinyl bucket seat ripped from an old Ford van and bolted to a swivel base. I spun around to face the kitchenette. It was not much. A mini fridge, a microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn, and a Mr. Coffee machine that had not been cleaned since the Clinton administration. I needed to take inventory. Survival is an equation. Resources, consumption, equals time. I opened the fridge. 2 Tupperware containers. One held my lunch, leftover venison stew. The other belonged to Miller, probably unimaginable horrors of mold. 3 cans of Diet Coke, a jar of pickled herring,
Classic Minnesota. A half-gallon of milk that expired 3 days ago. I checked the cupboards. A box of sugar cubes, a canister of Folgers, a sleeve of saltine crackers, stale. A bottle of hot sauce. Water. That was the immediate choke point. The machine room had a sink, fed by a line that ran up the north tower. It was heat-traced to prevent freezing, but it relied on city pressure. I went to the sink and turned the handle. A brown sputter, then a clear stream. It was still flowing. "Think," I whispered. "Storage." I looked around the room. I needed volume. There were no buckets in here. They were all out in the hazardous materials locker on the catwalk, and I was not going back out there right now. I grabbed the coffee pot, filled it, poured it into the empty milk jug after dumping the sour milk down the drain, filled the pot again. I scanned the room for anything else watertight. The trash can. It was a rigorous plastic Rubbermaid bin.
I dumped the trash, coffee grounds, candy wrappers, greasy paper towels, onto the floor. I scrubbed the inside of the bin with dish soap and the hot water that was miraculously still working. Then I placed it under the tap. It would not fit. I found a length of clear vinyl tubing in the maintenance locker, usually used for siphoning hydraulic fluid. I washed it out as best I could, jammed one end onto the faucet, and ran the other into the trash can. I watched the water level rise. It was slow, glacial. While the water ran, I moved to the windows. I needed to black out the room. If the power failed, I'd be dark anyway, but for now, the interior lights made me a beacon in the sky. I found a roll of duct tape and some cardboard sheeting we used for gaskets. I taped the cardboard over the north-facing windows first, the ones overlooking the city. The sun was beginning to set. The light outside was turning that bruised purple color specific to northern winters. I stopped to listen. The screaming had changed. It was not a continuous roar anymore. It was sporadic. Bursts of noise, followed by heavy, pregnant silences. Gunshots cracked through the air, crisp, dry pops. They sounded like a hammer hitting sheet metal. Pop. Pop, pop. Pop. Someone was making a stand down there. The trash can was half full. I checked the pipes under the sink. If the power went out, the heat tape would die. The water inside the vertical riser would freeze within hours, bursting the pipe. I was drinking from a ticking clock. I shut off the tap when the bin was full. I had maybe 15 gallons of water. If I rationed it to a half-gallon a day, I had a month, assuming it did not freeze. The cold. The machine room had an electric heater, a 220-volt industrial unit mounted on the wall. It was humming bravely, pushing warm air against the inevitable heat loss of the steel walls. But that heater depended on the grid, and the grid depended on people. I walked over to the electrical cabinet. This was my domain. The bridge ran on a 480-volt three-phase service. We had a backup generator in the South Tower base, a massive Caterpillar diesel. But I could not reach it. I had cut the walkway. If the grid died, the generator might kick on, but it would not send power up to the span unless the transfer switch in the basement engaged. I was cut off from the generator controls. I was sitting on top of a dormant machine that needed massive energy, and I had no way to generate it. I needed to secure the bridge mechanisms. The LOTO, lockout, tagout. I opened the main breaker panel. The heavy switches were labeled in dymo tape. Main drive north, main drive south, brakes, lighting, HVAC. I pulled the handle on the main drive motors. The heavy thunk of the contactors opening echoed in the room. I fished a padlock from my pocket, my personal safety lock, and threaded it through the lockout hasp on the breaker handle. I clicked it shut. Now, even if someone hot-wired the controls downstairs, the motors would not turn. The bridge was dead in the water. Or rather, dead in the air. I sat back in the chair, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up to me. The adrenaline that had fueled the gangway demolition was fading, replaced by a dull ache in my shoulders. I ate the venison stew cold, straight from the Tupperware. It tasted like garlic and iron. Night fell completely. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the structure. The steel frame of the bridge sang, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I turned off the overhead fluorescent lights. The sudden darkness was absolute inside the room. I let my eyes adjust, the only illumination coming from the LEDs on the control panel, green for power available, red for fault. I peeled back a corner of the cardboard on the south window, looking out toward the lake. It was a black void. No ships, no navigation lights, just the infinite cold of the water. Then I moved to the north window. Duluth was burning. Not the whole city, but pockets. I saw a massive fire raging near the hillside, maybe the hospital. The flames reflected off the low cloud deck, casting an orange glow over the snow-covered streets. The street lights were flickering, entire blocks going dark as the grid started to destabilize. I saw movement on the bridge approach. Under the orange glare of the burning city, I saw the swarm. They were pushing onto the bridge deck, moving past the abandoned cars. Hundreds of them. They reached the edge where the span should have been. I watched through the binoculars. They did not stop. The ones in front were pushed by the ones behind. They tumbled off the edge of the abutment, falling into the canal water below. It was a slow, steady stream of bodies, like lemmings, driven by a madness I could not comprehend. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. "You're just a bearing," I whispered to myself, looking at my reflection in the dark glass. "You're just a loose bearing in a broken machine." I turned away from the window and looked at the space I had claimed. A 12 by 20 steel box, a heater that would soon die, 15 gallons of water, a bag of tools. I checked the temperature gauge on the wall, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. I laid down on the floor, using my tool bag as a pillow. I kept my hand on the handle of the impact wrench. The wind battered the walls, screaming to get in. Tomorrow the power would likely fail. Tomorrow the water would stop. Tomorrow, the cold would try to kill me. But for tonight, the bolts held. The steel was true. I closed my eyes and listened to the bridge groan, shifting its weight against the wind. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times, but tonight, it sounded different. It sounded like a fortress. The end of the modern world did not sound like a bang. It sounded like a relay clicking open, followed by the angry, rhythmic beeping of the uninterruptible power supply in the corner of the control room. I woke up instantly. My internal clock read 4:13 a.m. The silence that followed the UPS alarm was heavy, physical weight. The low-frequency hum of the 480-volt transformers, a sound so constant you only notice it when it's gone, had vanished. The vibration in the floor deck ceased. The electric heater on the wall ticked once as its heating element began to cool, contracting in the sudden absence of current. I sat up in the dark, my breath blooming in a gray cloud illuminated by the strobe of the UPS warning light. Red, black, red, black. I checked the temperature gauge on the wall. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It had dropped 10 degrees while I slept. Outside, the wind was hammering the north face of the bridge with renewed fury,
A gale force sheer coming off the lake that sounded like a freight train derailment happening in slow motion. "Step 1, I whispered, my voice sounding raspy and small in the steel box. "Confirm isolation." I clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I walked to the main distribution panel. The voltage meters were dead zero. The utility power indicator was dark. I waited for the thrum of the backup diesel generator from the South Tower basement. It should have kicked on automatically after a 10-second delay. I counted to 20. Nothing. The automatic transfer switch was down in the basement, likely jammed or electronically fried. Or maybe the generator had tried to start, sucked in a lungful of stale fuel, and died. It did not matter. The result was binary. I had no power. No power meant no heat. No heat meant the machine room, a steel box suspended 135 feet in the air, would equalize with the outside temperature within 6 hours. The forecast was for a low of -10 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, cognitive function slows down. Fingers lose dexterity. Then you just go to sleep and do not wake up. I stood there, shivering in my thermals, and did the math. The battery on the UPS would last maybe 30 minutes, keeping the critical logic controllers alive for a system that no longer moved. I reached over and silenced the alarm. The quiet returned, sharper this time. I needed a heat exchanger, and I needed it before my hands got too cold to hold a wrench. I could not build a wood fire. The machine room was tight. Open combustion would fill the space with carbon monoxide in 10 minutes, and I'd be dead before I finished my first can of beans. I needed a sealed system, a stove. I scanned the room with my headlamp, looking not at objects, but at raw materials. The problem: containment and exhaust. The fuel. I looked at the maintenance locker. I had manuals, paper, some cardboard, and a few wooden pallets outside on the catwalk. But wood burns fast and has low energy density. I needed BTUs. Then I remembered the reservoir. The bridge operated on massive hydraulic cylinders. While the main tanks were in the towers, we kept a localized supply in the machine room for the pilot valves. A 55-gallon drum of ISO 32 hydraulic fluid sat in the corner, strapped to the wall with seismic bracing. Hydraulic fluid is essentially refined mineral oil. It has a high flash point. It's hard to light, but once it burns hot and long. It has nearly the same energy density as diesel fuel. I was going to build a waste oil drip stove. I moved to the kitchenette. I needed copper tubing for the fuel line. I grabbed the mini fridge, spun it around, and attacked the back panel with a multi-bit screwdriver. The compressor coil was a beautiful loop of 1/4 inch copper. I used a pair of side cutters to snip the line, hearing the hiss of the refrigerant escaping, an environmental crime that no longer mattered. I carefully uncoiled about 4 feet of the tubing, straightening it out by rolling it between 2 flat pieces of scrap wood to prevent kinking. Next, the combustion chamber. It had to be steel, thick enough to withstand 800 degrees, but thin enough to cut with the tools I had on hand. I looked at the electrical spare parts cabinet. It was a gray Hoffman enclosure, NEMA 12 rated, about 18 inches square and 8 inches deep. Perfect. I dumped its contents, fuses, relays, contactors, onto the floor. I set the box on the heavy steel workbench. The door had a rubber gasket for dust sealing. That had to go. It would melt and stink. I scraped it off with a razor knife. Now, the surgery. I grabbed the Milwaukee cordless drill and the index of cobalt step bits. I clamped the box down. The sound of the drill biting into the 14-gauge steel was a shriek that cut right through my ear protection. Chink! I drilled a 4-inch hole in the top for the chimney. I drilled a 1-inch hole in the side, near the bottom, for the air intake. I drilled a 3/8-inch hole near the top of the side wall for the fuel drip line. I worked with a kind of feverish precision. My breath was coming in visible puffs now. The metal of the box was cold enough to sting my bare fingertips, so I wore thin mechanics gloves, sacrificing some tactile feedback for warmth. For the chimney, I needed rigid pipe. The electrical conduit running along the ceiling was 2-inch EMT, electrical metallic tubing. It was galvanized, which was a problem. Burning galvanized steel releases zinc oxide fumes, metal fume fever. It shakes you like the flu.
But I did not have black iron pipe. I'd have to burn the zinc off outside first. I climbed up the stepladder and used a hacksaw to cut a 6-foot section of conduit from a dead lighting circuit. The blade bit into the metal, the rhythm of the cut warming my tricep. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. When it broke free, I carried the pipe out to the catwalk. The wind outside was ferocious. I tied the pipe to the railing with wire so I would not lose it over the side. I used a propane torch from the plumbing kit to heat the bottom foot of the pipe, the part that would get hottest. The zinc coating bubbled, turned yellow, and flaked off in white wisps that were snatched away by the gale. I torched it until the metal was dull gray and angry. Good enough. Back inside, the cold was settling into the concrete floor. My feet were numb blocks. I needed to hurry. I returned to the combustion chamber. A simple box is not enough. You need a burner surface. I found a cast iron brake rotor that Miller had used as a doorstop for 3 years. It was heavy, dense, and would hold heat. I placed it inside the steel box. The oil would drip onto this hot iron, vaporize, and burn. Now, the delicate part. The draft. A stove is an engine that runs on air. Too much, and you blow the flame out. Too little, and you make soot and carbon monoxide. I took a 2-inch steel electrical junction box cover and bolted it over the 1-inch air intake hole I drilled. I left the bolt slightly loose, creating a sliding damper. I could tap it open or closed with a wrench to tune the air-fuel mix. I mounted the steel box on a stand made of unistrut channel, bolting it securely to the floor near the north wall. I could not have it tipping over if the bridge vibrated. The chimney exit was the most dangerous step. I had to breach the house. The walls of the machine room were sandwich panels, 2 sheets of steel with 2 inches of polyurethane foam insulation in between. If the hot chimney pipe touched that foam, the whole room would become a toxic gas chamber. I measured a spot on the wall, high up, avoiding the structural columns. I used a 3-inch hole saw. The drill bucked and twisted as it tore through the inner steel skin. Then came the foam, yellow, crumbly. Then the outer skin. A blast of freezing air shot through the hole like a solid jet of water. I wrapped the 2-inch conduit in a thick layer of fiberglass insulation I scavenged from inside a defunct heater panel, securing it with stainless steel wire. I fed the pipe through the hole. The fit was tight. I packed more fiberglass around the opening, sealing the gap. It was not code compliant, but it would stop the foam from igniting. Finally, the fuel delivery system. I took a plastic 1-gallon jug that had held window washer fluid. I cut a hole in the cap and epoxied the copper tubing into it. I inverted the jug and hung it from a unistrut ceiling support using zip ties, about 4 feet above the stove. Gravity is the most reliable pump in the world. I ran the copper line down to the stove, bending it gently. I installed a small brass needle valve, scavenged from a pneumatic actuator line, in line, about chest height. This was my throttle. I connected the copper line to the stove, feeding the tip just inside the hole, positioned so it would drip directly onto the center of the cast iron brake rotor. I stepped back. It looked like a piece of Giger-esque sculpture. A gray box, scarred with drill marks, sprouting wires and tubes, bolted to the floor. Time to test. I filled the washer jug with hydraulic fluid using a funnel. The amber liquid was thick, like syrup, due to the cold. It moved sluggishly. I hoped it would flow. I opened the needle valve. I watched the tip of the copper tube inside the stove. Wait. Wait. Drip. A single, heavy drop of oil hit the cold brake rotor. Drip. About 1 drop every 2 seconds. I crumpled up a handful of pages from a system maintenance log, 1998 to 2004, and shoved them into the box under the drip. I struck a match. The paper caught. Yellow flame filled the box. I closed the door, latching it tight. Now the anxiety set in. I watched the smoke seep out of the seams I had not sealed perfectly. It was acrid, smelling of burning gloss paper. The draft had not established yet.
The chimney was cold. It was not pulling.
"Draw, you bastard," I hissed. I tapped the air intake damper open a millimeter. Inside the box, the paper was burning down. If it went out before the iron rotor got hot enough to vaporize the oil, I'd have to start over. But cleaning out a box full of unburnt oil sludge is a nightmare. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic huff, huff, huff. The sound of the draft catching. The heat was rising in the pipe, creating a vacuum, pulling fresh air in through the intake. I looked through the air intake hole. The flame had changed. It was not just burning paper anymore. The oil hitting the hot iron was flashing into vapor, and that vapor was igniting. The flame shifted from a lazy yellow to a roaring, aggressive orange-blue. Whoom, whoom, whoom. The stove began to sing. The steel sides of the Hoffman box started to discolor, turning a straw gold as the temperature climbed. I felt the radiant heat hit my face. It was the most beautiful feeling I had ever experienced. I adjusted the needle valve, increasing the drip rate. The roar deepened. The stove was hungry. I checked the chimney exit on the wall. No smoke inside. The draft was pulling hard. I put my hand near the wall pass-through. The steel skin was cool. The insulation was holding. I sat down on the floor in front of the stove, stripping off my heavy gloves. I held my hands out, watching the skin turn pink as the blood rushed back into the capillaries. The temperature in the room was stabilizing. Problem 1. Heat. Solved. Problem 2. Water. I had 15 gallons in the trash can, but that was a finite resource. The bridge was surrounded by water, Lake Superior, but it was 135 feet down. Hauling it up bucket by bucket on a rope in high winds was a calorie-negative activity. I'd burn more energy fighting the wind than I'd gain from the water. But I was surrounded by snow. The catwalks were covered in it. Drifts piled up against the windward side of the machine room. Snow is inefficient. It takes 10 inches of snow to make 1 inch of water, but I had heat now. I had excess BTUs. I needed a melter. I found a 5-gallon bucket that had held floor dry. I cleaned it out. I drilled a series of small holes in the bottom, then lined the bottom with a piece of Scotch-Brite pad to act as a filter. I suspended this bucket over my clean water trash can using a piece of spare railing pipe. I went outside. The wind tried to push me off the catwalk, but I stayed low, gripping the handrail. I used a flat-bladed shovel to scoop up clean, white drift snow from the roof of the machine room. I filled the bucket, packing it down tight.
Back inside, I placed the bucket rig near the stove. The ambient heat of the room would not be enough to melt it fast. I needed to direct the heat.
I took a piece of aluminum flashing, flexible sheet metal, and fashioned a scoop, a cowl that wrapped around the stovepipe and directed the hot rising air toward the bucket. Within 20 minutes, I heard the sound. Drip, drip, drip. Water filtering through the snow, falling into the reservoir. I watched the system run for an hour. The oil dripped, the fire roared, the snow melted. I leaned back against the legs of the operator's chair. My hands were greasy, smelling of hydraulic fluid and copper oxide. My body ached from the weird angles of drilling and cutting. But the house was alive again. It was not the hum of electricity. It was the roar of combustion. A more primitive heart, but a beating one. I checked the oil drum. 55 gallons. At a burn rate of maybe half a gallon a day to keep the room above freezing, I had fuel for 3 months. I finally allowed myself to look out the window again. The fires in the city had spread. The glow was brighter now, illuminating the low cloud ceiling in a sick, pulsing orange. I could see the silhouette of the lift bridge towers against the light. Down on the approach ramp, the movement had stopped. The bodies were just dark lumps in the snow. The cars were white mounds. The screaming had ended. I keyed my radio one last time. Control, this is Thorne. I have established emergency heating and water. I am secure in the North Tower machine room. Bridge is locked in the raised position. Over. Silence. Then, for the first time, a crackle. It was not Miller. It was not a dispatcher. It was a voice I did not recognize, distorted by distance and weak signal. Any station. This is the Arthur M. Anderson. We are holding position. 3 miles off. Entry is blocked. Repeating. Entry blocked. The Anderson. An ore boat. A 1,000-footer. They were out there on the lake, waiting for a bridge that would never open. I looked at the lockout padlock hanging on the main drive breaker. I touched the cold steel of the key in my pocket. "Captain," I whispered, not pressing the transmit button. "Turn around." I sat in the glow of the waste oil burner, listening to the drip of the oil and the drip of the water. 2 rhythms. The clockwork of survival. I was an engineer on a bridge to nowhere, and for now, I was warm. I pulled my logbook from the desk drawer. I clicked my pen. Day 1. Grid failure at 4:13. Heater constructed. Water system active. Isolation holds. I closed the book. I did not write about the screaming. The log was for data. The screaming was just noise. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. I kept seeing the gap in the walkway. 6 feet of empty air. The only thing keeping the monsters out. But gaps work both ways. I was safe from them. But I was also trapped with myself. And as the adrenaline faded, leaving me alone in the flickering orange light, I was not sure which company was worse. The bridge began to scream on the morning of the 14th day. It was not a human sound. It was a harmonic resonance, a vibrating hum that started in the main lift cables and traveled down through the steel skeleton of the tower until it rattled the teeth in my skull. I was sitting on the floor, sharpening my buck knife on a whetstone, when the frequency shifted. It went from a low, dull moan to a high-pitched shriek, like a wet finger circling the rim of a crystal glass the size of a skyscraper. I knew that sound. Every structural engineer knows it, even if they do not want to admit it. It's the sound of aeroelastic flutter. The bridge was no longer resisting the wind. It was dancing with it. I stood up, dropping the knife. The floor of the machine room, a solid slab of steel and concrete, pitched imperceptibly to the left, then corrected. I looked at the barometer I had salvaged from the wall mount and set on the desk. The needle had dropped so low it was practically touching the stop pin. 2850 an arc rue, and falling. A bomb cyclone. The type of low-pressure system that turns Lake Superior into an inland ocean of hatred. I moved to the south window. I had to scrape a layer of frost off the inside of the glass despite the stove chugging away in the corner. The world outside was gone. A whiteout.
The snow was not falling down. It was moving horizontally, a solid wall of ice crystals driven by 60-knot sustained winds with gusts pushing 80. I could not see the canal below. I could not see the city. I was floating in a gray void of turbulence. And then I smelled it. Acrid, sharp, the unmistakable stench of phenolic resin and hot metal. Brake fade. No, I whispered. I grabbed my headlamp and sprinted for the door that led to the machinery deck, the interior catwalk that ran alongside the massive cable drums. The machine room is separated from the drum room by a fire door. I threw it open and was hit by a wall of noise and smoke. The main hoist drums, two massive cylinders the size of cement trucks wound with 2-inch steel rope, were vibrating violently. The brakes on the Duluth lift bridge are gravity-set, spring-released shoe brakes. Giant curved arms clamping down on a 4-foot diameter wheel. They are designed to hold the million-pound span stationary against gravity. But they are not designed to hold it against a hurricane pushing the span sideways, torquing the guides, and acting like a giant sail. I shone my light on the number 1 drum brake assembly. Smoke was pouring off the shoes. The wheel was turning, slowly, painfully creeping. Creak, bang, creak, bang. The wind was pushing the raised span, forcing it up or down by inches, overcoming the static friction of the brakes. The shoes were slipping. If they got too hot, the friction lining would glaze over. Once that happened, the holding power dropped to 0. If the brakes let go, the 900-ton counterweights inside the towers would drop, and the span would rocket upward into the bump stops, likely shearing the sheaves off the tower tops. Or, if the wind load was downward, the span would crash into the canal. I needed to engage the auxiliary span locks. These were 4 massive steel bolts, 2 on each end of the span, that could be extended into pockets in the tower legs. They mechanically pinned the bridge to the tower, taking the load off the cables and brakes. We usually drove them with electric motors, but I had no electricity. I ran back to the control room, grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag, and threw on my parka. I did not zip it. I did not have time. I grabbed the master key, a 3-foot-long cast-iron manual crank handle that looked like it belonged on a Model T Ford, only heavier. I had to go outside. The manual drive for the North Tower span locks was located on the external machinery platform, exposed to the lake. I clipped my safety harness into the D-ring on my chest. I double-checked the carabiners. If the wind caught me wrong, I'd be a kite. I opened the exterior door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a solid punch to the chest that staggered me back a step. The noise was deafening, a roar that drowned out my own thoughts. I lowered my head, squinting through my safety goggles, and stepped out onto the grating. The cold was instantaneous. It bypassed my clothing and went straight for the marrow. This was wind chill in the -40s.
I clipped my lanyard to the handrail. Click. Safety first. Always safety. Even at the end of the world. I had to walk 30 feet to the gearbox housing. The catwalk was slick with rime ice, jagged and uneven. I shuffled, keeping my center of gravity low, gripping the rail with death-white knuckles. The bridge beneath me shuddered. It felt like a living thing in pain. The vibration from the slipping brakes transmitted through the steel, buzzing in the soles of my boots. I reached the gearbox. It was a gray steel casing bolted to the main girder. A small access cap covered the manual input shaft. I tried to unscrew the cap with my gloved hand. Frozen. "Come on!" I screamed, the wind tearing the words away. I pulled a brass drift punch and a hammer from my bag. I struck the edge of the cap. Clang. Again. Clang. The ice shattered. I spun the cap off. I inserted the square end of the iron crank into the socket. It fit with a satisfying metallic thunk. Now for the physics. The gear ratio on the emergency drive was something like 400 to 1. It took 400 turns of the crank to move the lock bolt 1 inch. The bolt had to travel 18 inches to seat in the tower pocket. 7,200 turns. I braced my feet against the stanchion and started to crank. 1, 2, 3. The resistance was immense. The grease inside the gearbox had turned to wax in the cold. Every rotation was a battle against viscosity. 10. 20. My shoulder burned. The wind tried to rip the handle from my grip. I had to time my efforts, pushing on the downstroke when the gust lulled, holding firm when it surged. Inside the tower leg, unseen, a 4-inch diameter steel pin was slowly extending. 100. I checked the visual indicator, a painted yellow rod extending from the housing. It had moved 1/4 of an inch. I worked. I became a machine. I disconnected my mind from the burning in my lungs and the numbness in my toes. I focused on the circle. Round and round. The rhythm was the only thing that existed. 500. The vibration in the deck was getting worse. I could feel the slip-stick shudder of the main brakes failing. If the span dropped before I got the pin in, the shear force would snap the locking bolt like a twig and probably take my arms with it. 1,000. I needed to switch arms. I let go with my right, grabbing with my left. The relief was short-lived. My left arm was weaker, and the cold had stiffened the joint. I looked down. Through the mesh of the grating, through the swirling snow, I saw something dark in the water of the canal below. The ice was breaking up. The surge from the lake was driving massive, jagged plates of ice into the canal. And amidst the ice, bobbing in the black swells, were shapes. Debris? Logs? No, they were bodies. The jumpers. The people pushed off the edge days ago. They had not sunk. The cold had preserved them, kept them buoyant with trapped gases. They bobbed in the violent water, a macabre flotilla crashing against the concrete piers of the bridge. They looked like they were trying to swim. I gagged, bile rising in my throat. I forced my eyes back to the crank. 2,000. I was hallucinating from the exertion. I thought I heard a voice. "Hey!" I kept cranking. It was the wind. "Hey! Up top!" The sound was distinct. It cut through the roar of the gale. It was not the wind. I froze. The crank handle held at the 6 o'clock position. I looked over the railing toward the south tower. The span connects the two towers. I was on the north. On the walkway of the south tower,
Across the gap I had created by destroying the gangway, someone was standing. They were wearing a bright yellow offshore survival suit, the kind used on oil rigs or crab boats. A hood was pulled tight. They were waving both arms. "Do not drop it!" the voice screamed. It was a woman's voice, distorted by distance and wind, but powerful. I stared. It was impossible.
The south tower was inaccessible from the ground, unless you breached the heavy security doors or climbed the exterior lattice, which was suicide in this weather. She pointed at the span. Then she pointed at the gap between the span and her tower. "The locks!" she yelled. "North side only! Do not lock the south!" I stared at her, uncomprehending. The procedure was to lock all 4 corners. If I only locked the north side and the brakes failed, the bridge would pivot. It would hang from the north pins and swing down like a pendulum, ripping itself apart. "Why?" I screamed back. She cupped her hands. "Counterweight! The south counterweight is off the track. If you lock it, it jams!" I looked at the south tower. I could not see the internal mechanism from here, but if she was right, if the massive concrete block inside the south leg had jumped its guide rails due to the vibration, locking the span would force the bridge into a rigid geometry that could not accommodate the misalignment. The stress would buckle the tower. The whole structure would collapse. I had to trust a stranger in a survival suit standing on a ledge in a hurricane. "Who are you?" I yelled. She did not answer. She just pointed at my crank. "Lock north. Leave south floating. It'll ride out the sway." It made a twisted kind of mechanical sense. If the north was pinned, the bridge would act like a cantilever. The south end would float on the brakes, cables, moving slightly to absorb the wind energy, while the north held the position. It was risky. It put massive torque on the north pins, but if the south weight was derailed, it was my only choice. I turned back to the crank. Adrenaline, fresh and hot, flooded my system. I cranked harder. The yellow rod extended. Halfway. 3/4. The screech of the brakes behind the wall reached a crescendo. Screech! I felt the bridge lurch. A drop, maybe 6 inches. My stomach hit my throat. "Come on!" I roared, throwing my entire body weight onto the handle. Clack. The sound was different. Solid. The crank stopped dead. The pin was home. I immediately reached for the locking pawl on the gearbox, flipping it to engage the anti-reverse. I fell back against the railing, gasping for air. The bridge groaned, a deep, structural complaint. But the vibration changed. The frenetic, high-frequency buzzing stopped, replaced by a dull, rhythmic thudding as the south end bobbed slightly in the wind, pivoting on the north pins I had just set. It held. I looked across the gap. The figure in the yellow suit was still there. She gave me a thumbs up, a slow, deliberate motion. Then she collapsed. She did not fall off the edge. She just crumpled, sliding down the wall of the machine house until she was a pile of yellow neoprene on the grating. I stood there, paralyzed by the logistics. She was on the south tower. I was on the north. Between us lay 386 feet of bridge span, but at the end of that span was the 6-foot gap I had created. I had destroyed the gangway, and she was outside, exposed, in a blizzard. I could not leave her. She had just saved the bridge. She knew the mechanics. That meant she was an asset. I unclipped my safety lanyard. I grabbed the crank handle. It was a heavy iron bar, a weapon and a tool. I ran.
Running on the open grating of the bridge span in 70 miles per hour winds is like running on a treadmill that someone is shaking. The wind tried to sweep my legs out from under me. I stayed low, using the central Jersey barrier of the roadway as a windbreak. The snow scourged my face, freezing my eyelashes together. I reached the south end. The gap I had made was a dark mouth waiting to swallow me. I looked across. She was slumped against the wall, maybe 10 feet away from the edge of the gap. "Hey!" I yelled. She did not move. I looked at the gap. 6 feet. On a calm day, easy. In this wind, with ice on the takeoff and landing surfaces. I scanned the structure. The span had a maintenance railing. The tower had a balcony railing. They were roughly aligned. I took the coil of rope from my tool bag. I tied a bowline knot around the railing post on my side. I did not have enough rope to make a bridge, but I had enough for a safety swing. I clipped the other end to my harness. I stood on the edge of the span.
The water was a long way down. The bodies were bobbing. "Do not think," I muttered. "Execute." I backed up 3 steps. I ran. I jumped. The wind hit me mid-air, a side gust that pushed me left. My trajectory drifted. I was not going to land on the grating. I was going to hit the rail. I slammed into the south tower railing chest first. The air left my lungs in an agonizing whoosh. My ribs crunched. I scrambled, boots scrabbling on the icy steel, gloved hands fighting for a grip on the frozen pipe. I hung there for a second, dangling over the abyss, the wind swinging me like a pendulum. Then I pulled. A chin up, a muscle up. I flopped over the rail and hit the deck hard. I unclipped the rope. I crawled to the figure in the yellow suit. I grabbed her shoulder and rolled her over. She was conscious, but barely. Her eyes were unfocused, the pupils blown wide. Hypothermia, or exhaustion. Her face was covered in a ski mask, frosted white. "Can you move?" I shouted. She blinked. "Leg," she mumbled. "Broken." I looked down. Her right leg was twisted at a sickening angle below the knee. She must have climbed the tower with a broken leg, or broken it getting here. I could not drag her back across the gap. That was impossible. I looked at the door to the south tower machine room. It was locked. I did not have the key for this side. "Hang on," I said. I took the manual crank handle I had carried with me. I jammed the square end into the door latch mechanism. I used it as a pry bar. I braced my boot against the frame and pulled. The lock cylinder popped with a snap. I kicked the door open. It was dark inside, cold, but out of the wind. I grabbed the woman by the drag handle on the back of her survival suit. I hauled her inside, sliding her across the floor. I kicked the door shut and jammed the crank handle through the handle to bar it. The silence inside was sudden and shocking. The wind was just a muffled roar again. I fumbled for my headlamp. I shone it on her. She pulled off her ski mask. She was young, maybe 30. Her skin was gray, her lips blue. She had a cut on her forehead that had bled and frozen into a red icicle. "The counterweight," she whispered, her teeth chattering violently. "Did it hold?" "It held," I said. "We're floating on the south, pinned on the north." She nodded, her eyes fluttering shut. "Good. I'm Kira." "Elias," I said. "Do not sleep, Kira." I looked around the south machine room. It was identical to mine, but dead. No stove, no water. But I was not alone anymore, and the bridge was still standing. I sat down next to her, shoulder to shoulder, sharing what little body heat we had.
I checked my ribs. Bruised, maybe cracked. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. But inside, the equation had changed. Resources, consumption, equals time.
My resources just doubled. Skills, knowledge. But my consumption just doubled. Food, water, heat. And I was on the wrong side of the gap. My stove was 400 feet away. Problem for tomorrow, I whispered. I leaned my head back against the cold steel wall and listened to the wind try to kill us. It failed. The extraction from the south tower was not heroic. It was a physics problem involving friction coefficients and leverage. Kira could not walk. The tibia in her right leg was snapped, the bone held inside the skin by the tension of the muscle, but unstable. Moving her back to the north tower, my keep, meant crossing the 6-foot gap I had created in the walkway. The gap that separated the living from the dead, but also separated us from the heat. I left her wrapped in a tarp in the south machine room and made the jump back to the span alone. The wind had dropped to a manageable 40 knots, but the temperature was still deep in the negatives. My ribs ached with every breath, a sharp, grinding reminder of my impact with the railing. I scavenged a 12-foot aluminum scaffold pick, a specialized plank with hooked ends, from the maintenance rack on the north tower. It weighed 60 pounds. Dragging it against the wind was like wrestling a sheet of plywood in a gale. When I reached the gap, I slid the plank across. The hooks caught the south tower railing with a reassuring clank. I did not carry her across. That would have raised our center of gravity too high. I lashed her into a sked stretcher, a rollable plastic sled I found in the south emergency locker, and tied a tagline to the north railing. I crawled across the aluminum plank first, locking my boots around the rails, then pulled her across behind me like a barge. The plastic sled hissed over the aluminum. Below us, the black water of the ship canal churned, hungry and waiting. Once we were inside the north machine room, the warmth hit us. It was not comfortable, maybe 50 degrees, but compared to the outside, it felt tropical. The waste oil stove was still chugging, the flame a steady, rhythmic pulse. Medical first, I said, kneeling beside her. Then logistics. I cut the leg of her survival suit open with trauma shears. The limb was swollen, bruising, purple and yellow. It was not compounded, thank God. No bone sticking out. But it was shortened. The muscles had spasmed, pulling the broken ends past each other. I need to pull traction, I said, looking at her. It's going to hurt. A lot. Kira looked at the ceiling, her jaw set. She was shivering, not from cold, but from shock. Do it. Just do not count to 3. I hate it when people count. I did not have a traction splint. I had a workshop. I went to the tool crib and grabbed a 1-inch ratchet strap, the kind used for securing cargo, and a length of unistrut channel. I padded her ankle with a roll of shop rags and duct tape, creating a hitch. I anchored the unistrut to her boot with more tape, extending it past her foot. I hooked the ratchet strap to the unistrut and the other end to the heavy steel leg of the workbench. I cranked the ratchet. Click. The strap tightened. Click. Her leg straightened. Kira let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream, her hands gripping the legs of the operator's chair until her knuckles turned white. Click. The alignment looked true. The shortening was gone. I stopped. Done, I breathed, sweat dripping into my eyes. Now we cast it. I did not have plaster. I used a tube of construction adhesive and strips of cardboard, reinforced with hose clamps tightened gently over the padding. It was an ugly, industrial exoskeleton, but it was rigid.
She passed out shortly after. I covered her with the sleeping bags near the stove, checked the oil drip rate, and sat in the chair to watch the sun come up over a frozen, dead world. Time stopped being linear. It became cyclical, defined by the consumption rates of our systems. The calendar on the wall still said November, but outside, the seasons ground forward with agonizing slowness. We stopped using names for days. There was only Fuel Day, Water Day, and Storm Day. My life shrank to the dimensions of the machine room, 20 feet by 12. Kira's recovery was slow.
For the first month, she was cargo. I had to handle everything, the water melting, the stove cleaning, the perimeter checks. But even bedridden, she was an engineer. She lay on her back, staring at the exposed wiring of the control panel, and optimized our existence. "The stove," she said one evening, her voice rasping from the dry air. "You're running it rich. The flame is too orange. You're wasting hydrocarbons." "It keeps it warm," I grunted, stirring a pot of rehydrated soup on the burner plate. "It's making soot," she corrected. "Restrict the intake damper by 2 millimeters and raise the fuel reservoir. You'll get a cleaner burn and extend the drum life by 12%. I did it. She was right. The flame turned a translucent blue, and the oil level in the drum dropped slower. By week 6, she was hobbling on a crutch I made from a broom handle and a padded armrest. That was when the dynamic shifted. We were not just survivors anymore. We were a crew. We divided the labor. I was heavy mechanical and EVA, extravehicular activity. She was electrical and signals. Our biggest threat was not the infected or the raiders, who had mostly frozen to death or moved south, but the calorie deficit. The junk food from the kitchenette was gone. We were down to a few cans of beans and a bag of rock-hard bouillon cubes. We turned to the sky. The bridge was a high point, a roost. Seagulls, desperate and scavenged, still landed on the tower tops. I built traps along the railing using snare wire and breadcrumbs made from the last of the saltines. It was grim work. A gull is not a clean animal. It's a flying rat made of gristle and hate. I remember the first one I caught. I brought it inside, its neck already wrung. "Protein," I said, dropping it on the workbench. Kira did not flinch. She picked up a scalpel from the first aid kit. "Breast meat and legs. Boil the rest for stock. We can grind the bones for calcium supplements." We ate gull stew for 3 months. It tasted like fish oil and despair, but it kept our muscles from atrophying. We saved the feathers for insulation, stuffing them into the gaps around the window frames. Nothing was wasted. January brought the deep freeze. The thermometer outside hit -35 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for a week. The bridge groaned constantly, the steel contracting so tight I thought the rivets would pop like rifle shots. This was the test of our fuel supply. The 55-gallon drum of hydraulic fluid in the North Tower was running dry. We had maybe 5 gallons left, a week of heat. The South Tower had a 500-gallon diesel tank for the backup generator. It was the Holy Grail. But it was 400 feet away, across the span, in the unheated tower. "We need a pipeline," Kira said, looking at the schematic she had drawn on the wall with a grease pencil. Carrying buckets across the gap in this ice is suicide. One slip and you're in the canal. "We do not have 400 feet of hose," I countered. "No," she pointed to the ceiling. "But we have pneumatic lines running the length of the bridge for the air tools, 3/4-inch hardline." "They're frozen," I said, "filled with condensation ice." "So we clear them." We spent 3 days on the project. I went to the South Tower,
accessed the generator room, and disconnected the fuel pickup line. I rigged the hand pump from a scavenged hydraulic jack. The hard part was the pneumatic line. I had to walk the length of the bridge, using a propane torch to heat the steel pipe every 10 feet, listening for the hiss-crack of ice melting inside. It was brutal, freezing work. My fingers cracked and bled inside my gloves. When the line was clear, I connected the pump on the south side to the pneumatic line. On the north side, Kira rigged a fitting to dump directly into our reserve drum. I pumped. It took force. The diesel was gelled, thick as molasses. I had to heave on the handle with my full body weight. A hunk. "Flow," Kira's voice crackled over the handheld radio. "We have flow. It's dirty, but it's flammable." We transferred 50 gallons that day. My back spasms were so bad I could not stand up straight for 24 hours. But we had bought another winter of life.
The stove roared with the new fuel, hotter and cleaner than the hydraulic oil. The thaw arrived in April, not with warmth, but with sound. The ice on Lake Superior began to break up. It sounded like artillery fire. Massive plates of ice, miles wide, ground against each other, pushed by the wind. The noise echoed off the hull of the bridge, a constant thundering boom that made sleep impossible. But with the open water came the smell. The city below had been frozen for 5 months, preserved. Now, it was thawing. The stench of rot wafted up from the streets, garbage, sewage, and thousands of unburied bodies. We kept the windows sealed. "We're isolated," Kira said one morning, looking through the binoculars. "But we're blind." She was obsessed with the radio. The handhelds were short-range, useless for anything beyond the bridge. But the bridge had a marine radio system, a high-gain VHF antenna mounted on the very top of the North Tower, 200 feet above the water. "If there's anyone left," she said, "they're on the water. Ships, islands. We need to listen." The radio in the control console was dead. The circuit boards had been fried by a power surge during the initial collapse. Kira spent weeks cannibalizing parts. She stripped copper wire from solenoid coils, scavenged capacitors from the elevator control board, and built a Frankenstein receiver on the desk. She needed to tune the antenna. "I have to go up," she said. "You're still limping," I said. "The ladder to the crown is vertical, 80 feet, no cage."
"My arms are fine," she snapped. "And you do not know the VSWR settings. If you mismatch the impedance, you'll burn out the only transistor we have." She was right. I harnessed up and climbed behind her. It was a slow ascent. She pulled herself up rung by rung, dragging her bad leg. I stayed right below her, my hands hovering near her boots, ready to catch her if she slipped. We were 2 specks on a steel needle, suspended above a rotting city. At the top, the view was vertigo-inducing. The curvature of the earth was visible on the lake horizon. The water was a deep, bruising blue, littered with white ice floes. Kira worked on the antenna junction box. Her movements were precise, reverent. She adjusted the trim pots, watching a multimeter she had salvaged. "Got it," she whispered. "Low SWR. We're resonant." She keyed the mic of the rig she had strapped to her chest. "CQ, CQ. This is Duluth Aerial Bridge, monitoring channel 16. Any station." Static. The white noise of the universe. She tried again. "CQ, this is the bridge." We waited. The wind whipped our hoods. Then, through the static, a voice. Faint. Rhythmic. "Keep clear. Navigation hazard. Isle Royal automated beacon. Keep clear." It was a recording. A looped warning from a lighthouse 50 miles away. Kira slumped against the railing.
A machine, she said. Just a machine talking to ghosts. It has power, I said, looking at the horizon. If a beacon is running, someone is maintaining it. Or it has solar. Maybe, she said. She looked down at the city, then out at the endless lake. Or maybe it's just like us, running on momentum. We stayed up there for an hour, taking turns scanning the horizon. We saw a dark shape far out, maybe 10 miles. A ship? A drifting barge? It was not moving. It was just another piece of debris on the water. We climbed down in silence. Spring turned to summer. The smell from the city faded, baked away by the sun or washed clean by the rains. The bridge became a vertical garden. We hauled dirt up in buckets, soil scavenged from the decorative planters in the canal park. We spread it in shallow trays on the catwalks. We planted seeds found in the break room lockers, an old packet of tomato seeds, some dried beans. Watching a green sprout push through the black soil on a steel grate 135 feet in the air felt like a miracle. It was the only green thing in a world of rust and gray. Our routine hardened into a religion. 6:11. Wake. Check the stove. Even in summer, we ran it low for water distillation. 7:11. Perimeter check. Binocular sweep of the streets. We mapped the movements of the dog packs that had taken over the downtown. We watched the few remaining human scavengers, skittish, violent figures, scuttling between buildings. We never signaled them. We pulled the ladder up. We were the gods in the tower, indifferent and removed. 12 o'clock. Maintenance. Greasing the bearings. Not for the bridge to move, we had welded the gears, but to prevent the structure from rotting. Rust never sleeps. 18 Alec. Radio watch. Listening to the static. Recording the weather. One night in August, a thunderstorm rolled in. A true Midwestern hammer. Lightning forked down, hitting the water, turning the night into a strobe-lit war zone. We sat in the machine room, the lights off, watching the show through the rain-streaked glass. The bridge vibrated with the thunder, a deep bass note that I felt in my chest. You know, Kira said, breaking the silence. We could leave. I looked at her. Her leg was healed, though she walked with a permanent hitch. She was thinner, harder, her hands calloused and stained with grease. Leave? I asked. To where? The boat, she said. There's a Coast Guard cutter tied up at the station. I've been watching it. It has not moved. If we could get down, get the engine running. The lake is big, I said, and empty. It's better than a cage, she said. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked at the dark water. I touched the cold glass. This is not a cage, I said. It's an anchor.
I looked at the stove, the water distiller, the radio, the tomato plants on the catwalk. We had built a universe here, a machine that turned cold and death into life. If we go down there, I said, pointing to the dark void of the street, we're just prey. Up here, we're engineers. We solve problems. Kira looked at me for a long time. The lightning flashed, illuminating her face. She looked tired, but she nodded. Okay, she said. We stay. But we need better insulation for the winter. The south window is leaking heat. I have a plan for that, I said. There's rubber matting in the generator room. Good, she said. She picked up her logbook. We'll need 400 square feet. Put it on the list. She wrote it down. Insulation upgrade. I went back to the stove and adjusted the needle valve. The flame settled into a perfect, efficient blue cone.
The storm raged outside, tearing at the shingles of the city, flooding the basements, washing away the remnants of the old world. But the bolts held. The welds held. I poured 2 cups of hot water. I handed one to Kira. "To the anchor," I said. She clinked her tin cup against mine. "To the anchor." We drank. The water tasted of smoke and metal, but it was hot, and we were alive. The radio crackled in the background, just static, rising and falling like the breath of the lake. We did not turn it off. We just stopped waiting for it to say anything new.
The signal was not the point. Listening was. I sat back in the operator's chair and watched the rain lash against the glass. I did not think about the future. The future was just a calculation of fuel reserves divided by days. I thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow, we would grease the sheaves. Tomorrow, we would harvest the first tomato. It was enough.